Let's move and discuss this with David Maddox, political editor over there at The Independent. David, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Ian.
Nice to have you with us again. Listen, let's start with reform. They are, big news this week. They launched their contract, as they called it, and we can have a little reminder of one of the things they talked about. This is Nigel Farage on net zero.
And we have been following net zero policies championed by Mrs May, enthusiastically embraced by Boris Johnson, and now being virtually copied by the Labour Party. We're pursuing net zero policies that are self-destructive. Just look at what it's doing to industry. What's happening to steel making in South Wales? It's going. But somehow government thinks that's good because we reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that we emit. But we don't. So we want to get rid of the subsidies that are paid to green energy companies by loading taxes on the electricity bills of everybody in this country, and we've been doing this now for the best part of 20 years.
So, David, that is, I suppose you could call that classic Farage right there. That's one of a dozen policies that were announced in this contract on Monday. And looking at our inbox here, we're asking the question this afternoon: what is the attraction of reform beyond immigration? And the thing that many people are coming up with is exactly that does, rightly or wrongly, speak the language of many people.
Yeah, I think reform has a much wider appeal on the right than just immigration. Now, obviously, Nigel Farage bangs on about immigration. I mean, in those debates, those seven-way debates, immigration was literally his answer to every single question. But the point about that contract, and in many ways, if it was a genuine manifesto, it would have been completely ludicrous and unaffordable, but it didn't matter. It was a tick list of what voters on the right of British politics and what a lot of sort of ordinary people feel angry about in terms of the net zero stuff and the cost around that. There were tax offers in there as well to ease the tax burden on, especially on middle income people. This was a tick list aimed at going after Tory voters who are now switching in huge numbers, if we're to believe the polls, over to Farage and reform. And the whole aim of this is to wipe out, to destroy the Conservative Party, and that's what he's trying to do.
I mean, I've certainly found it interesting, David, and I'm sure as a political editor, you too, that this Farage story is, I mean, it's worthy. He's had documentaries made of him before, or dramas. The whole Brexit thing became a couple of dramas came from that. But this is almost in another league. So this was the bloke that about half an hour ago said, I'm not standing. And then a few days later said, no, actually, I am going to stand. All hell sort of broke loose. And suddenly, he makes a prediction that he's going to be ahead of the Tories in the polls. I mean, in some polls, not all, but in some, he is. We all went, and I'm sure I can reasonably include you in this, David. We all said, well, it's not going to translate into Westminster success. Even the Clacton seat is still going to be difficult. It's a 30,000 majority the incumbent has over there. Even that's going to be tricky. So, yes, they might get votes like the UKIP 2015 thing, but they probably aren't going to translate that to Westminster success. Here we are today. I'm kind of rethinking that now and thinking, do you know what? They could. I can easily see 3 seats that they would get, and possibly 5 in that list.
Yeah, I mean, I actually broke the Clacton story. He considering Clacton back in January, and I never had any doubt he could win Clacton. One of the reasons for that huge majority in the 2019 election was because there was no Brexit Party candidate against Charles Watling. UKIP had won that seat twice in a by-election and a general election. Watling only won it in 2017 when UKIP was no more as such. And so I never had any doubt that they could win Clacton. I would have been at that point astonished if they could win anywhere else. But like you, I think I'm up to 3 possibles.
Yeah.
Including Lee Anderson in Ashfield and possibly Richard Tice in Boston
True.
and Skegness.
Yeah,
It's interesting that they are bunging all their advertising into Clacton and Boston and
yeah.
Skegness to win those 2 seats. So,
And Ben
yeah,
Habib as well, I think, is looking like he, could certainly cause some
certainly,
damage.
yeah, yeah.
It's interesting, but I think a lot of people only a couple of weeks ago didn't think any of that was possible. That, of course, would be, if you came back to Westminster with half a dozen MPs, you start to look like a bit of a party there in Westminster, rather than a sort of a Galloway-esque lone character on the back benches.
Yes, I think the point of this as well is if it is coupled with what is effectively a destruction of the Conservative Party, which is also on the cards. If the Conservatives come in south of 100 seats and they've got 4 or 5 seats, then, you're talking, it makes the possibility of what Farage wants in terms of a realignment of the right and maybe a new party or a new version of the Conservatives much more likely. But if he's ever to succeed in that, and I still think, the odds are against it, but if he's ever to succeed in that, he does need a foothold in Parliament. He needs to be there himself. He needs, as you say, 3 or 4 colleagues around him.
Indeed.
Well.
I am duty bound just to read the other candidates standing in Clacton. I know you don't have to go through all this faff in newspapers, but in the broadcast world, Matthew Ben Suleiman for the Liberal Democrats, Nigel Farage, Reform UK, Craig Jameson, Climate Party, Tony Mack, Independent, Natasha Osborne, Green Party, Jovan Owusu, Nepal, Labour Party, Tasso Papa Nastasio, Heritage Party, Andrew Pemberton, UK Independence Party, and Giles Watling, Conservative Party. That's how they stand over there. Let's move to another story here, David. That of Labour's secret tax rise plans revealed. Now, this was a Mail investigation. You might say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? I think at the moment this is, and it's not the greatest card, but it's the one that seems to be working a bit for the Tories, that if you vote Labour, you will get higher taxes, even though, economists will say if you vote for anyone, you're going to get higher taxes. But certainly that idea that Keir Starmer is planning some little backroom capital gains tax, a few other bits, council tax maybe. These have all come around in the last couple of days, that they are intending to raise an extra God knows how many billions, and the only way they can do that is asking people to pay for it.
Well, it is working, but it isn't. It's working in the sense it's the only thing that seems to unnerve Labour. And, a couple of those debates, Keir Starmer on the £2,000 per household increase, and then Angela Rayner on they're coming after your primary residency with capital gains tax, were both leaden-footed and allowed a kind of chink there for the Tories to kind of pile through and, claim that tax rises are on the way. But Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are saying that if they can afford it, they want to bring taxes down. And frankly, the polling suggests that people actually agree with them and actually are more likely to believe them than the Tories. So whilst that tactic certainly unnerves Labour a little, it doesn't seem to be translating in the polls at all. In fact, over the weekend, we ran a front page lead for the Independent, which showed, huge trust in Labour on tax, and trust in the Tories on tax had completely collapsed.
Yeah, I saw that. I think the Tories were behind Labour on everything, were they? Including Brexit at one point, which was the most extraordinary thing I'd ever read. But there you go. That's what the polling said.
The Brexit voters have almost all gone to Reform now. It's quite interesting on that.
And another bit of bad news, of course, for the Prime Minister, although he sounded quite relaxed about it when he was interviewed this morning. Tory donor John Caldwell, who once gave the Tories, the guy behind Phones for You. He's a billionaire, previously given £500,000 to the Conservatives, said he's going to be voting Labour for the first time. He encourages others to do the same. Here he is speaking on Talk earlier today.
Are you going to give Keir Starmer £500,000 as well?
No, I'm not. I'm not paying out.
I wouldn't. How much are you giving him?
Nothing. Zero.
Okay.
What I've given him is my support, and I hope that I will have some degree of influence in the Labour Party to discuss my ideas for how to grow the UK economy.
There it is. Some degree of influence. I mean, we could dwell on that point, I suppose, to a degree, David. I mean, it's often said that people, or high-profile people who support or donate, and he says he's not donating, but he is supporting, only do it because they want something in return. I mean, maybe but maybe he's talking in a benevolent way, perhaps, and I'm sure he is. But the significance of this for the Conservatives, does it make any difference, or is it just another nail in Rishi Sunak's political coffin?
It's just another note. I mean, there are two issues here. First of all, the Tories are running out of money. We were looking at the campaign spending on digital the other day, and Labour are just easily outspending them. I mean, on Google, I think it's like on Google Ads, which is incredibly significant, incredibly important area these days. It's like 10 to 1, and it's because Tory donors have given up on Rishi Sunak and the rest. But the other side relates to the previous question, really. On the tax issues and the economic issues, the big business people are now coming out in favour of Labour. They are more likely to believe Labour. It adds to the picture of Starmer and Reeves as being the ones who are best with the economy, which is amazing in an election, really. The Tories have lost that mantle.
Yeah,
but we've had Richard Walker, we've had others as well, and it's piling up.
I mean, the usual defence, not that it matters really. The Jeremy Hunt, current Chancellor, he would say, well, look, if this was all that easy, I'd be doing it, wouldn't I? Of course I would. We're not philosophically insane. We've got a sort of Keynesian underbelly to what we do economically between us. So, I'd be doing it already. Rachel Reeves is not the Messiah. And yet, whether people think that or not, the sense is, and I wonder whether it's more than just about specific policies, David, and it's more about, a new broom, something new comes in, even if it is quite similar, a different kind of thinking, or new thinking, new people can make the world a difference. It can pump a bit of confidence into the economy, and of course, the greatest enemy of economic growth is a lack of confidence. And so maybe it's more just that than anything specific that Rachel Reeves or Mr. Starmer has said.
Well, I think there's some truth in the claim that being an incumbent at the moment is a really bad thing. We're seeing it in elections around the world, in France, in Holland, in elsewhere, where incumbents are really being punished for the really terrible times we've been through, which, are not of their own making as such. There's wars and pandemics and so forth. But, the economic results of that, people are being punished for. But on the other hand, the Tories over the last 2 years, and I mean, I've been covering them now for two different brands. One was a pro-Tory brand, and now, the Independent. It's just been a story of chaos and complete ineptitude and infighting, and people have just given up. I think people have stopped listening to them because they seem to be just talking to themselves and arguing with themselves. Yeah,
the architect of their own downfall, and of course centred to exactly what you've just said, Boris Johnson. There was a bit of a dividing character despite his impressive win in 2019. Only yesterday on the programme we were asking the question whether Boris Johnson is the man who could save the Tories. I mean, it was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but there was the story that he was going to stick his signature on on leaflets that were going to be aimed at wavering voters. We wondered whether that would ever translate to a stage appearance with Mr. Sunak. Clearly unlikely, but you never know. Today we hear that he's not going to do any of that kind of stuff. He's probably going to leg it on holiday again.
No, indeed. I don't think there's any love lost there at all. He has no appetite whatsoever to help Rishi Sunak out. He and his supporters blame Rishi Sunak for his downfall. Whether that's completely fair or not is, another question. But I don't think there's going to be any help from Boris. I mean, he'll be happily sunning himself somewhere. I mean, if you look at the videos he sent out, it was all to his, loyal supporters, the ones who stuck by him around Partygate and before. None of the others have got anything, including the Prime Minister.
And of course, he doesn't want to, be on a losing side, does he? To stand up there talking about sunny uplands and how tomorrow could be your Independence Day, knowing that there's going to be an absolute trouncing on July the 4th. Yeah,
he definitely doesn't want. I think he's got an eye of a comeback himself. It could be interesting, the Boris versus Nigel show at some point. On the right of politics. But neither of them want to be associated with what will I think, be the worst defeat in 346 years of Conservative and Tory history.
I mean, when you put it like that, I mean, that's an incredibly powerful, well, what looks increasingly like a reality to come in a couple of weeks' time. I was about to say on Boris Johnson, I mean, I theorised when he went that at some point he might just come back, have a little, grin and bear it in opposition and then return as the kind of saviour. I wonder, though, whether with Boris the damage is just too deep now. And he's kind of, I don't want to say forgotten, because he's certainly not that, but he doesn't really have an irrelevance, even as a former Prime Minister.
I think at the moment the damage is too deep. It's too soon as such. There's too many people in the Conservative Party who dislike him intensely anyway, let alone the public. But, in 4 or 5 years' time, never say never. You never know with these big characters, people like Boris, whether you agree with their politics or not, they do seem to find a way of coming back in some form or other. So I would never rule it out with somebody like him.
Yeah.
I mean, others, don't have that kind of charisma, that same kind of Teflon nature. I would question it, but I just wouldn't rule it out at all with Boris.
Well, we'll watch with interest. Next few years are going to be amazing to cover this kind of stuff. Listen, David, thank you for your time. Really appreciate your take on these things. He's David Maddox, political editor at The Independent, with us here on Talk.